The snow came early that year, quiet as breath and twice as cold. By late October the wind had already stripped the last of the cottonwoods bare, leaving nothing but bone-pale branches swaying like they were searching for what they'd lost. Me Whitlock stood on the porch of her cabin with her shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, watching the long road from the east, the one that carved through the valley and disappeared behind the ridge like a scar. She wasn't waiting for anything in particular. She, given up waiting 2 winters ago when her husband rode out with a pack mule and 3 weeks' worth of supplies, never to come back. Since then she lived quiet, tending her goats and her root cellar, fixing what needed fixing and letting be what didn't. But that morning the air felt different, not the cold, though it bit sharper than usual, but something beneath the cold, like the wind carried more than frost. It was near sundown when she saw him. He came stumbling out of the tree line like a man halfway between death and the dream of it, all tattered wool and blood-stained linen. He moved slow, with a kind of careful pain, like his body was a thing he no longer trusted to hold him up. His coat was torn, boots nearly falling off, and his face was half covered by a scarf soaked dark. Me didn't move, not at first. She waited on instinct, heart steady, eyes narrow. The shotgun stood loaded behind the door. She wasn't a fool. But something in the way he looked up at her, just a flicker before his knees gave, and he crumpled to the dirt, loosened the knot in her chest. He collapsed like he'd been holding himself upright on nothing but will. No words, no cry, just the sound of a body falling to the frozen earth. Me exhaled through her nose. She didn't need another mouth to feed, didn't need the risk. But winter was coming. She stepped down off the porch. His name, he told her days later once the fever broke, was Elias. He said it quiet, as if the word tasted strange in his mouth, like it belonged to someone he no longer quite was. He didn't offer much more, and me didn't ask. She dressed the wound on his side, a ragged slash that ran from his ribs to his hip, crusted with dirt and likely infection. Took her hours to clean it proper. He didn't make a sound through it, just gritted his teeth and stared out the window like something out there was calling him. "Got a horse?" she asked once, and he shook his head. She didn't press. Me had 2 goats and a coop of half-wild hens. The stove kept the place warm enough, and the well hadn't frozen yet. She gave him broth and quiet, which seemed all he could manage. Most days he slept. The rest he stared into the fire like it held the shape of something he couldn't bear to name. She wasn't used to company anymore. The silence between them sat heavy at first, but not unkind. He never complained, never asked for anything. Just tried to sit up when he could, tried to move without groaning when the pain lanced through his side. "Where you headed?" she asked one morning as she changed the dressing. He looked at her like the question didn't make sense, like he'd forgotten there was anywhere else to go. "Nowhere," he said, and his voice was hoarse, like it hadn't been used in weeks. Me nodded. That answer made a kind of sense she understood too well. By the 3rd week he was walking, slow, stiff, but upright. Me gave him a coat that had belonged to her brother, long dead in some war neither of them had wanted. It was worn but warm, and Elias looked surprised to be handed it, like the weight of it on his shoulders made him real again. "You don't talk much," she said that night as they sat at the table, a single candle throwing soft light across their faces. He looked at her, not at the floor, not at the fire, at her. "I forgot how," he said. She didn't smile, but her voice softened. "That happens." Outside, the snow kept falling. The roof laked over the stove. Elias noticed before she did. He spent a morning patching it with tar and patience, even though his side still ached. Me watched from the ground, arms crossed, biting back the offer to help. When he came back down, his fingers were raw with cold, but there was a new steadiness in his step. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He shrugged, "Needed doing." And that was how it began. Not with grand gestures or swelling words, but with small things, quiet repairs, a fence mended, a new shelf built where the old one sagged. He found ways to give back, not out of obligation, but because something in him needed to. Me didn't ask what he ran from, didn't ask what had carved that haunted look into the lines of his face. She just let him stay. And in the deep of winter, when the world was all frost and silence, that was enough. The wind changed sometime in mid-December, turning mean. It howled down from the mountains like it remembered what had been taken from it. Me kept the hearth burning hot, splitting wood until her palms blistered. Elias joined her now. He didn't ask. He simply took up the axe and found a rhythm, steady and even, like the swing of it gave shape to something inside him. He spoke little still, but he had presence now, weight. When he moved through the cabin, me noticed the floorboards stopped creaking under his step. It was as if the house itself had started to recognize him, softening under his touch. He started carving again, though she hadn't known he ever did. She found the first piece by the stove, just a sliver of pine shaped into a bird, wings spread, beak open as if calling something far off. He didn't mention it, and she didn't ask. But a few days later there was another, this time a stag, proud and watchful. By the end of the week, a small kingdom of creatures had begun to gather on the mantel. Me found herself watching him when he worked. There was precision in his hands, even when they trembled, as if the act of creating was not just expression but survival. Once when she passed him a mug of steeped spruce tea, her fingers brushed his. He didn't flinch, just looked at her, quiet and long. That night she sat by the fire longer than usual, the silence between them filled with a hush that wasn't empty. Come Christmas, snow piled high against the door. Me had always passed the holiday alone since her husband vanished, marking the day only with an extra spoonful of jam and a candle lit in the window for no one. She expected the same this year. But when she came in from feeding the hens that morning, cheeks red from windburn, Elias had cleared the table. On it sat a carving, a fox this time, sleek and cunning, and next to it, a sprig of pine set carefully in a chipped jar. She stopped in the doorway, wet boots freezing to the floorboards. "It's not much," he said. His voice had grown stronger these past weeks, though still low. "But I thought it ought to feel different today." Me looked at the pine, then at him. "It does," she said. She made cornbread with the last of the buttermilk and found a tin of peaches she'd been saving. They ate slow, without ceremony. At one point he laughed, a short, startled sound, like it had escaped before he could remember he didn't know how. It took her breath in a way nothing else had in years. In January, a coyote got at the chickens. They found the aftermath in the snow, feathers strewn like some cruel snowstorm of their own. Me swore once under her breath but didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time. Elias saw to the fence. Me salted the earth around the coop, just like her mother taught her. That night she found him sitting on the porch with a rifle across his lap, eyes on the dark woods beyond. He didn't say he'd take watch, but he stayed out till dawn. The fire had burned low when he came back in, and me was half asleep in the rocking chair. "You didn't have to," she murmured, blinking up at him. He crouched beside her, the rifle resting against the wall now. "I know," he said. "That's why I did." Something in her chest cracked then, not like breaking but like thaw. February brought thaw by day and ice by night. The roof groaned under the weight of snowmelt. Me and Elias worked side by side in the mornings, repairing, hauling, warming the earth where they could. She caught him humming once, while sanding a new frame for the barn door. The tune was unfamiliar, something low and lilting. When he noticed her listening, he flushed, embarrassed. "Used to sing it to my little sister," he said, "before." He didn't say before what. She didn't need to know. "I'd like to hear it again sometime," me said. He nodded, maybe. The past hovered around them like fog on the ridge. Thick in the morning, fading by noon. It didn't vanish, but it stopped choking them. Late one evening, after a storm had raged for hours, me found Elias sitting on the cabin floor, back against the wall, staring at the door. She knelt beside him. "You all right?" He looked at her, eyes glassy, then down at his hands. "I did things," he said, "bad ones, before I came here, things that don't let a man sleep easy." Me didn't reach for him. She didn't flinch either. "I never asked you to be clean," she said, "just kind." He let out a breath like it had been trapped inside him for years. "I can't undo it." "No," she said, "but you can build from it." He looked around the cabin, the shelves, the carved creatures, the patched roof, the warm light. "I've never built anything before," he said. "You are now." And for the first time since he'd staggered from the woods, Elias leaned into her, just enough to rest his forehead against her shoulder. The wind outside still howled, but inside something settled, spring took its time. It always did in that part of the country, where the soil stayed hard until April and the trees remembered their green like a dream half forgotten. But the melt came all the same, slow and soaking, carving little rivers through the dirt behind the barn. Me planted early, fingers in the cold earth, the ache in her knees welcome after so many months inside. Elias built her raised beds from salvaged pine, sanded smooth and lined with stone. When he handed her the trowel that first morning, it was polished clean, the handle newly wrapped in leather. "Thought your hands deserved better," he said. She didn't answer, just took it and knelt, shoulders brushing his as they worked the rows in silence. By May, the hens were laying again. Me bartered eggs for flour and sugar in town, rode the mule down once a week with a basket over one arm. Elias didn't go with her. He never asked to. But when she returned, there would be fresh water drawn, the porch swept, something simmering on the stove. The little things he left behind, fresh kindling by the hearth, a fixed chair leg, a tin cup of carved handles he'd been shaping, made coming home feel like more than just walking through a door. He was mending in his way, not all at once. There were still nights she'd hear him rise from bed and walk the perimeter, the creak of the boards beneath his boots, the soft click of the rifle's safety. He rarely spoke of what woke him, but when he came back in, he always looked to her, as if to confirm she was still there, still real. She began leaving a candle burning low on the sill, just in case. In June, a neighbor rode through, Bill Ransom, all tobacco grin and idle questions. He eyed Elias warily, like a man trying to place a face he should have recognized. "New hand?" Bill asked. Me leaned on the porch rail, arms crossed. "Friend," she said. Elias stood just behind the door, not hiding, just watching. Bill tipped his hat and didn't press. Later, Elias said nothing, but she caught the way his jaw tightened as he chopped wood, each swing a little harder than it needed to be. "You don't have to run," she said that night, laying a hand on his shoulder. He didn't look at her. Men like me don't get to stop. "You already have, you just haven't realized it." He turned then, not quite meeting her gaze. "If trouble comes looking, you shouldn't pay the price for my past." "I won't," she said, "but I won't turn you out either, so you can decide whether to keep building or keep running." She left him with that. He didn't come to bed until hours later, but when he did, he lay beside her without a word, breath steady in the dark. The first harvest was meager but honest. Potatoes, onions, a few hardy greens. Elias dug a root cellar without being asked, deep and wide enough to last the winter to come. He worked until his hands bled, and when me found him sitting at the edge of the trench, dirt under his nails and sweat soaking his collar, she brought him water and sat beside him. "You work like a man who owes the ground something," she said. He looked out across the field, squinting into the sun. "I do," he said, "but maybe I can repay it here." One night in July, thunder rolled over the hills and broke the sky wide open. Rain came down hard, shaking the roof, flooding the path. The lanterns flickered, and me lit every candle they had. Elias stood at the window, face turned toward the storm like he was listening for something beyond the thunder. When the wind rattled the shutters, she went to him, resting her palm against his back. "You're safe now," she said, quiet. He nodded, though his eyes stayed on the trees. "Doesn't feel real sometimes, like if I blink too long, it'll all be gone." Me looked around the cabin. Warm light, solid walls, the soft rise of bread baking in the hearth oven. "It's real," she said, "because we made it so." Outside, the storm raged, but inside, Elias turned from the window and took her hand. Not as a man who needed saving, but as one learning how to stay. August brought heat like a held breath. The hills turned gold, the grass crisp underfoot, and the sun bled long across the porch each evening. Me took to sleeping with the windows open, letting in the scent of dust and pine, the rustle of night creatures passing through the brush. Elias stayed close during those weeks, not out of fear, but instinct. He split his time between the barn and the shed he'd started framing by hand, a place he said would store tools, maybe hold the weight of new plans. Me watched him work, shirt damp with sweat, focus unbroken. He moved like a man rebuilding more than timber. The shed grew slow, careful, each board laid straight, each nail driven with patience. He was building something lasting, and the ground beneath it seemed to know. One afternoon, she brought him water, and he leaned against the frame, brushing sawdust from his arms. "I used to think all I was good for was tearing things down," he said. "Now I'm not so sure." Me looked up at the shed's bones, the way it caught the light. "It's a good thing to learn late," she said. They found a stray dog a week later, thin, mangy, with a limp in its hind leg and eyes like it had seen too much. Me nearly turned it away. She knew better than to let softness into places that already held so much weight. But Elias knelt in the dirt beside it, speaking low and calm until it nosed his palm. "Name him," me asked, wary. Elias scratched behind the dog's ear. "Don't think he needs one. He's here now, that's enough." The dog slept by the hearth from then on, twitching through dreams no one could mend. But it stayed, and that staying meant something. The garden thickened by late summer, squash curling heavy on the vine, tomatoes ripening red and warm under the sun. Me canned what she could, filling jar after jar, the pantry shelves beginning to resemble something close to abundance. Elias added a second row to the fence, then fixed the ladder me had cursed all season. He didn't ask what she needed. He just noticed and did. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, he'd sit beside her with a carving knife and a scrap of wood, hands steady now, the lines of his face easier. Not soft, no, he'd never be soft, but sure. One night he offered her a figure, a woman, carved from oak, standing with her head tilted toward the wind. "She reminds me of you," he said, "still but strong." Me took it, fingers tracing the grain. "She looks like someone who's waited long enough." He met her eyes, then I hope she found what she was waiting for. She set the figure on the mantel, beside the fox and the sparrow and the bear he'd shaped over the months. "She might have," she said. There was a fire on the western ridge in early September. Smoke curled on the horizon for 2 days before the wind changed. They stood side by side, watching the plumes rise against the setting sun, neither speaking. Me's breath caught in her throat. The last fire she'd seen had taken her neighbor's barn, nearly the woods beyond. "If it turns this way," she started. "I'll fight it," Elias said, firm. "I won't let it take what we've made." That word we settled in her like a promise. The fire never reached them. The wind shifted again, and the rain came 2 nights later, soaking the hills. But the fear stayed a little longer, as old fears do. They slept close after that. The space between them narrowed not by need, but by choice. By harvest, Elias had planted a row of cedar saplings along the property line. Me hadn't asked why, but when he caught her looking at them, he said, "So something strong grows here long after we're gone." She touched his hand then, lacing her fingers through his. Not to comfort, not to tether, but to answer. Autumn settled with a hush that made the world feel reverent. The air thinned, crisp with the scent of dried hay and smoke from distant chimneys. Trees flared gold and rust, their leaves falling soft as breath. Me hung herbs to dry from the rafters, filled the cabin with the sharp green of sage and thyme. Elias tightened the shutters and lined the windows with oilcloth, speaking little but moving with intent. The shed was finished now, no longer a place for just tools. Inside, he'd built a bench with drawers, each one neatly labeled, and a small wood stove he'd salvaged from a trader passing through. On the walls, hooks held his carving tools, glinting in the filtered light. But in one corner, under a cotton cloth, rested something different. Me found it one afternoon when she brought him coffee. He didn't stop her when she lifted the cloth. Beneath it sat a cradle, handcrafted, its joints seamless, its base gently curved. Her breath caught. She turned to him, but Elias was already watching her. "You built this?" she asked. His voice was quiet. "I started it long ago, before I ever came here. Didn't know why I kept the pieces until now." Me said nothing at first, just ran her hand along the smooth edge. "There's not a child," she said finally. "No," he replied, "but maybe one day, or maybe just for someone else. Either way, it felt right." Me looked around the shed, this small kingdom of his, born not of power, but of presence. "You're building more than walls here," she said. He nodded once, a breath deep in his chest. "I'm trying." In late October, they hosted their first gathering. Just a few neighbors, Bill Ransom and his wife, the Carsons from 2 hills over, old Miss Ellery who brought apple cake and stories with no clear end. The cabin filled with voices, laughter, the sound of boots on wood, and the scrape of chairs drawn close. Elias kept near the edge of the room at first, quiet but not withdrawn. When someone asked how he'd come to be there, me stepped in. "He showed up when I needed someone," she said. "Didn't know it then, but I think he did too." It was enough. The others nodded, and the talk turned to weather and livestock and what to do about the foxes near the creek. That night after the last lantern had been extinguished and the dishes stacked to dry, Elias stood at the hearth, staring at the mantel. The carvings were all still there, joined now by a small cedar tree no taller than a man's hand. "They accepted me," he said, not quite a question. "Me came to stand beside him. They did." He looked down, hands clasped in front of him like a prayer. "You did." "I didn't offer you mercy," she said. "I offered you room. That's more than anyone ever gave me." "Then maybe they didn't see you right." He turned to her then, and for the first time really smiled. It changed his whole face, less shadow, more light. The dog passed in early November, quietly curled on the porch, breath slowing to stillness. Me found Elias there at sunrise, crouched beside the stiffening body, one hand resting on the dog's head. "He stayed," Elias murmured. "That's what mattered." They buried him near the saplings. Me carved a small marker. Elias didn't speak much for the rest of the day, but that night he reached for her hand across the table, held it in both of his like something fragile and true. "We've both lost," he said, "but we keep building." She squeezed his hand gently. That's what makes it a kingdom. The second winter came gentler than the first. Snow still fell, heavy and slow, but the cold no longer felt like a threat. It was something known now, something prepared for. Inside the cabin, the walls held warmth not just from fire, but from living, from presence. Me moved through her days with a steadiness born of shared rhythm. There was no longer a sharp edge to the silence between them. It had softened into comfort, into belonging. Elias took to waking early, even before the frost cleared from the windows. He stoked the fire, set water to boil, then sit by the window whittling. Not always animals anymore, sometimes just shapes, curves, pieces he would sand smooth and store in a carved box. "I don't know what they'll be yet," he told her once, "but they'll become something." Me understood. Some things needed time to take shape. One morning, just after the new year, Elias returned from checking the traplines with a letter in his coat pocket. Stamped and yellowed. A courier had passed through town, left it with Bill Ransom who, despite all his suspicion, had begun calling Elias friend when he thought no one heard. Elias held the letter like it might vanish if he blinked. "It's from my sister," he said. "Didn't think she'd still be alive." Me sat with him at the table while he opened it. His hands shook, but his eyes didn't leave the page. "She thought I died," he said after a long while, "but she never stopped lighting a lamp for me each night." He looked up at me, his voice breaking in the middle. "She says I have a niece, that she'd like to meet the man I became." Me said nothing at first, just reached across the table and laid her hand atop his. "Then let her," she said, "let her see what's been made of you." He didn't leave right away. They spent 2 more weeks stacking wood, sealing the seams around the barn, fixing the gate that had always hung crooked. But one morning near dawn, Elias packed a satchel and saddled the mule. Me stood by the fence, arms wrapped around herself. She wasn't one to beg, and she didn't need to. "I'm coming back," he said, before she could ask. "Just need to make peace with what came before, so I can live honest with what's ahead." She nodded, but her chest ached in that old, familiar way. Still, she didn't try to hold him. "I'll keep your place," she said, "and the fire warm." He leaned down from the saddle, brushing her cheek with his thumb. "You built more than a place," he said. "You gave me a reason." Then he rode out, down the same road he'd once stumbled up half-dead and full of ghosts. Me spent the days tending what they'd made. She added new rows to the garden plan, oiled the tools, cleared the snow from the shed roof. In the evenings, she wrote letters she never sent, folded them into the carved box Elias had left behind. When spring finally came, it came quick, as if the earth had been waiting to bloom under her hands. The cedars were taller, the fence was firm, and when the day came that she saw his figure crest the ridge again, coat worn, beard thicker, but eyes steady, she felt no surprise. only the warmth of something long hoped for, and now home. Elias dismounted without a word, walked to her, snowmelt soft beneath his boots. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." She studied him, noting what time had taken and what it had given. "Was it worth it?" she asked. He nodded. She forgave me, said I'd already paid my debt, just not where I expected. Me stepped forward, laying her palm against his chest. "You built a kingdom," she said, "and you belong to it now." He took her hand in both of his, just as he had so many nights before, but this time there was no tremble in it, only certainty. "I don't want to build alone anymore," he said. "You never did," she replied. And with that, the door to the cabin opened, not just to shelter, but to everything they had made sacred by staying. The kingdom they built was not gold or grandeur. It was presence. It was healing. It was choosing each other every day without fanfare. And that, in the end, was enough to make even the broken whole.